Hello, I'm Daniel Green, president of the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Presidential Scandal and the Media, From Nixon to Trump, a conversation with Jill Wine-Banks and Peter Slevin. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago that supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. We've been free and open to the public since 1887. The Newberry recently reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in our reading rooms, or you can drop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Friday afternoons to see our two fall exhibitions, Renaissance Invention and Decision 1920, A Return to Normalcy. The Rosenberg Bookshop at the Newberry is open on Tuesday through Friday afternoons, and you can always shop online on our website. For the safety of our community, our public programs will remain virtual for now. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our many digital resources, online classes, and virtual public programs like this one. I'd also encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. During this program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. Our Conversations at the Newberry series is now in its 10th season. This series of programs, generously supported by Sue and Melvin Gray, is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Jill Wine-Banks is currently an MSNBC legal analyst. She's had a remarkable and varied career, but I'm going to keep my introduction brief and focus on her role in the Watergate scandal. After becoming the first woman to serve as an organized crime prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., Jill Wine-Banks was selected as one of 3 assistant Watergate special prosecutors, where she was again the only woman in the obstruction of justice trial against President Nixon's top aides, including his attorney general, chief of staff, and chief domestic advisor. Her new book, The Watergate Girl, looks back on that period, a moment when the justice system was tested by corruption in the White House and when a young woman fought to receive respect from her male colleagues. Peter Slevin is associate professor at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications. A contributing writer for The New Yorker focusing on national politics, Slevin also spent a decade on the Washington Post national staff, including 6 years as the Post-Chicago bureau chief. He served for 7 years as the Miami Herald's European bureau chief, chronicling the collapse of communism in Central Europe and the Soviet Union. His reporting has taken him around the globe, though national politics have long been a particular source of interest. Slevin's book, Michelle Obama, A Life, was named one of the top biographies of the year by PEN America in 2015. And I should say that you can purchase The Watergate Girl and Michelle Obama, A Life at the Newberry's online bookstore. And if you'd like a signed book plate from either Peter Slevin or Jill Wine-Banks, please add that to the comments section while you check out during the purchase. Please join me in welcoming Jill Wine-Banks and Peter Slevin.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Danny, and hello, everyone. It is a pure pleasure to be at the Newberry, at least virtually or spiritually, to talk about really one of the most remarkable periods in American political history and the lessons it holds for us. We're so lucky to talk with Jill, who is pretty much the perfect person. We can hardly have a better partner in this. Her early ambition, in fact, was to be a journalist. She spent some time as a journalist before crossing over to the dark side and becoming a lawyer and a prosecutor. She turned to the law and did some pretty special things. And now, of course, as Danny said, she's all over MSNBC and has a rather astonishing almost 500,000 Twitter followers. I suspect many of you may be here as a result of that, and we are glad you're here. We'll have a chance to talk about Jill's book, The Watergate Girl, and one of the most startling, troubling, and memorable periods in American political history. Or maybe I should say we'll have a chance to talk about 2 such periods, because we're going to talk about the current day too. In Jill's book, she writes with a sense of deja vu. that today the peril is worse than in the 1970s because Trump is more dangerous than Nixon. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. As Danny said, please submit your questions in the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A icon, and there's a way to do it on Facebook as well. In reading Jill's terrific book, which I commend to you, I've been thinking back to August 9th, 1974, and that scene of Richard Nixon leaving the White House across the South Lawn to Marine One, that moment when he has resigned the presidency to everyone's kind of amazement, although it certainly was a long time, long buildup. And remember, he walked up the steps of Marine One and he turned around and he flashed, raised his arm and he did his Churchillian V for victory sign. That very day, Gerald Ford, thrust into history somewhat unexpectedly, took office, and he said in what may be his most memorable statement, he said this, he said, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men." That was 46 years ago. And I'd like, Jill, to ask you to put yourself back in that place on that day as you watched on what I think was a black and white television. Do you think that was true then? Did you think it was true then?
That's very vivid to me. But before I answer your question, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be with the Newberry Library. Growing up in Chicago, it was always an iconic building and location. Even the square that it sits on, which was then known as, I don't know if it's still called this, Bug House Square, was a place that encouraged free speech. And so it's very much, I'm very proud to be part of this today. I have very vivid memories of that day when he resigned and flew away. And I think a little background might be helpful to the audience, which is it took 3 Republicans, including the former presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, and the leader of the House and Senate, to approach the White House and to say to Richard Nixon, "We've heard the evidence and you will be convicted on the impeachment charges if you do not resign." It was the Republicans who said that to him. And that's because back then we had bipartisanship, we had facts. People paid attention to what was true. We weren't living in the bubbles of Fox News and MSNBC. Everybody shared the same facts. And so that's an important background fact for that. And we maybe can get to this later, but he was afraid to tell his own family that he was resigning. And he asked Rosemary Woods, who we will talk about later, to do that for him, which shows something about their relationship and how much more of an advisor and consultant with him she was. She was not just his secretary. But on that day, for us in the office of the Watergate Special Prosecutor, it was still a work day. And the first thing that came to my mind was not that the nightmare was over, but that we had an opportunity to indict Richard Nixon. We had wanted to indict him. We had more than ample evidence of criminality and had that in our hands. But Leon Jaworski, who had replaced Archie Cox after the Saturday Night Massacre as special prosecutor, was adamant that impeachment was the right course and not criminal indictment. And because there was a legitimate bipartisan investigation going on, that wasn't an outrageous decision. We compromised with him by providing to the impeachment committee the evidence we had gathered so that they didn't have to start from scratch. They had grand jury testimony. We got permission of the court to do this. We could not have done it without permission of the court, but they had the tape recordings. They had grand jury testimony. And so that was fairly reasonable then. The risk we were running was that the jury, in the rest for all the other defendants who were his top aides, might acquit because as we called him, and I think I refer to this in the book, the big enchilada, which was Richard Nixon, because he was getting off scot-free, they might think it was unfair to punish everybody else. So we worried about that, but that was the compromise we made. The day that we heard about the resignation, we went back to Leon, some of us, including me, and said, you argued that it would interfere with his job as president. He's no longer president. He's a private citizen. He should be indicted. And so that might take us forward not very long after that. As we debated this with Leon Jaworski, he got pardoned by Ford. So I don't want to jump ahead because I think you wanted to ask about that. So I might stop there, but I felt on that day that part of the nightmare was over, that a criminal president was out of office, but that justice had not yet been done. And so there was still more to be done.
And did you feel, it was a month later when President Ford did decide to pardon Richard Nixon, what was your reaction?
Probably anger and distress. Again, for us, it meant work. We researched, what does a pardon mean? Can he pardon prospectively? He hadn't been indicted. What was he pardoning him for? Could he pardon him for all crimes that he might have committed in a certain time period, even though he hadn't been indicted? And what we found was, yeah, he probably could, and he had, and that a pardon is forever. So we were unable to indict at that point. There is a slight difference with the reality now, because in some ways, Richard Nixon certainly suffered a penalty for his criminal conduct. There's no question about that he was forced from office in disgrace. That is a very serious penalty. So that's a little different than where we are now, where the articles of impeachment were tried before the Senate and there was an acquittal. And so there has been no consequence as of now. So whether it's right or wrong to indict a former president remains a question. We didn't get to answer that because of the pardon. I don't know whether there will be an opportunity to consider that question anew, both from a political standpoint and from a legal standpoint. Legally, of course, it's possible. There's no question about it, both at the state level and at the federal level. Politically, one of the things that Gerald Ford said was that he felt we needed to move forward. We needed to put this nightmare behind us. And in a way, if the election turns out that Biden is elected president, there are many people who would like to see him address the policy issues that face the nation and not do this. Those same people might say New York State can handle the criminal investigations and do that on their own. So it's still a political and a moral question as to what to do with a former president. One who resigns is one thing, one who just is voted out of office is another thing.
Those are fascinating questions. They were then and they are now, and I can see in the Q&A we'll be coming back to that before we finish our conversation today. Given your experience with Watergate, I'd love to go back and talk about your role then and what you were up against, what you were facing, what you were accomplishing. And for those who don't remember all the nitty-gritty of Watergate, it was a long stretch from June 17th, 1972, when a night watchman at the Watergate complex saw a door ajar and went in and found the 5 Watergate burglars, to August 9th, 1974, when Nixon did resign. And along the way, if everyone will remember, there was this curious break-in, which really never was explained. It never seemed to add up to very much. It wasn't even entirely clear, unless I'm mistaken, what they were even after. And there were these 2 reporters who got on it early. That would be Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward at the Washington Post. They were Metro reporters. They were working on the city desk. And this was their beat. Big decision was inside the paper. As it got bigger and bigger, should they take these young guys off and give it to the big guy, the big feet? They didn't. Howard Simons and Ben Bradley kept them on this story, and it grew and grew. It's sometimes forgotten that it was after the break-in that Nixon won a landslide in November 1972. The Senate hearings, there were Senate hearings, And of course, eventually there was a special prosecutor, and the prosecutor recruited some very, very talented lawyers along the way, as everyone was trying to figure out what exactly Nixon had done. And the circle of people close to him who were in trouble was growing wider. There were breaks in the story. Some came from Capitol Hill. A lot of them did come from the media. There was an electrifying appearance in the Senate hearing room by Alexander Butterfield, who said, well, as a matter of fact, President Nixon, he taped his phone calls. Well, that was really something, as we all now know. And along the way, Jill was recruited from the ranks of organized crime prosecutors to join the prosecution team, which was vast, and it had different pods or committees. But you focused on the obstruction. And I'm curious what you recall about how Nixon responded to the charges against him or the allegations against him, because of course he went after the media. We'll get to that. But in your position as a prosecutor, what were you up against?
Hoax, witch hunt. Sound familiar? That's what he was saying. And stonewalling at every step of the way.
Which is where we kind of got to know that word, if I'm not mistaken,
yes,
too.
I think so. It became very popular. And it was a series of events that really broke the case. And there are some parts that I don't think get proper credit. Certainly Woodward and Bernstein are important in the development of the story, but so is bipartisanship, because at the same time we were appointed, a Senate committee, a select committee specially designed to look at presidential crimes was conceived and implemented under Senator Sam Ervin, who was the perfect person to lead the committee, but it was bipartisan. He sat side by side with Senator Baker, and the questioning was very civil and was designed to elicit facts, not to make speeches, but to get facts out. We had the benefit by the time we were appointed, this was May of '73. So it's almost a year after the crime, which, by the way, the crime was June. By January, so in 6 months, the burglars had been convicted. What is the missing piece in between the conviction in January and our appointment in May? And I joined the team as soon as we were appointed. I basically started the same day that Archie Cox was sworn in, I think, was McCord. There were, all the burglars, all were identified the night of the break-in as former CIA agents. They were Cuban Americans, but there was one who was not a Cuban American who gave an alias. And so nobody knew who he was for a few days. And then it was discovered that it was James McCord, who was the chief of security for the committee to re-elect the president, known as CREEP. And I'll use that going forward. They had an unfortunate acronym, I'm sorry. And that was, to me, as a prosecutor, long before I was appointed to Watergate, but just when I was reading it back in the summer of '72, I went, oh, this is not just a random burglary of the Democratic headquarters. This is clearly political. If you have the head of security. And then very quickly after that, it was identified that Howard Hunt, who was a White House employee, was involved, and that Gordon Liddy, who was also a CREEP, had been with the White House, but was now with CREEP, were involved. Clearly, this was not a random break-in. Despite that being obvious, you're correct. Richard Nixon won a landslide. He won 49 out of 50 states. He won the popular vote and the Electoral College. And his inauguration was shortly after the verdict in the burglary trial. And he had accomplished a lot of things that bipartisan support. Title IX, benefiting women, opening China, creating the EPA. Those were things that were universally beloved. And so he had a lot of support, and that's just how it was. So then we get, beyond that, we had John Dean, who had a phenomenal memory. He testified before the Senate without knowing that there was a tape recording. And he testified from memory because he was escorted out of the White House without his documents. And it turned out he had a phenomenal memory. His only mistake in testifying was to say something happened at the Mayflower Hotel, which became well known because of a Russian contact with Sessions at the Mayflower Hotel. But
also
it actually happened.
Also where Monica Lewinsky stayed when she came back to testify, as I recall.
Oh, I don't remember, but she lived in the Watergate, by the way. So there's that too.
It was fake.
But it actually happened in the Mayflower coffee shop of a different hotel. That's the only mistake he made. It's insignificant, irrelevant. And he was in our office cooperating with us when we heard the most dramatic thing. But let me finish with McCord, because what happened in McCord's case was Judge Sirica, who was the judge in both the burglary trial and then eventually in the obstruction of justice cover-up case, he just didn't believe that it was just these guys off on their own. He knew there was someone, and he kept pressing them for who else was involved. On the eve of sentencing, as a means of probably trying to get a better sentence, McCord wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, which basically says, "You were right, Your Honor. There were higher ups involved. We paid hush money to keep the defendants quiet. There was perjury committed. Subornation of perjury took place." So we had a pretty clear path that there was going to be crimes involved by the time we were appointed, because he wrote that letter in March. And by then, John Dean had been fired in April, and he started cooperating with us and turned out to be a brilliant, fabulous witness. So that's what we had by that point. And then when Butterfield testified, because keep in mind, for all of you listening, if it's the president's word against John Dean, who was basically, an Ivy League youth. I mean, he was 30, maybe 35 years old. It would have been, the benefit of doubt would have gone to the president.
Which is older than you were.
Yes,
you might point out.
Yes, it's true. That's true. But still young. And so we knew that we'd have trouble if it came down to the president denying and John Dean saying it happened. When we heard that there were tapes, John Dean was in our office when it happened. And we knew right that minute that we had to subpoena those tapes. And then we got into the question of executive privilege. No such thing as absolute immunity, by the way. There is executive privilege, however. And so we carefully selected just 9 tapes that we thought we could prove were criminal conversations. Because in order to overcome executive privilege, you have to show that it's part of crime or fraud exception. If it's political, you can't get it. And so some of them were conversations with Dean, one of which was, of course, the cancer on the presidency speech, which seemed to be a dramatic one. And if we could get that and prove that he actually had said those words, it would bolster Dean's credibility enormously. So that's how we came to that. Hearing the testimony, and we had a television going at all times because we needed to follow what was happening in the Senate and make sure that they didn't immunize someone that we wanted to prosecute. And one of our lawyers, George Frampton, happened to be at the television when Alexander Butterfield testified. And he came running in. And so we sat down and started immediately drafting a subpoena. And then the question was, who delivers the subpoena? You can't just walk into the White House and knock on the door and say, here, I have a subpoena for you. But it was a civil time, and his lawyers agreed that they would accept the subpoena service. And of course, then he said, but you can't have them. And he stonewalled and stonewalled.
Got it. So before we leave the case itself, and it really was, at least watching from the outside at the time, it was a whodunit, and that you were really waiting to see what shoe would drop, and and who was in the kitchen with the parlor with the candlestick, like what was really going to happen. And there was a magical, kind of hilarious moment when someone you came to cross-examine in due course, Rosemary Woods, you mentioned her, Richard Nixon's trusted secretary. in dealing with the tapes and explaining the tapes, said, well, there was this gap, which was never resolved, what was in that 18.5-minute gap. It was missing. It had to be explained. And she testified, and I think there's a photo of this that you witnessed.
Yes.
As she enacted this in her White House office, in the West Wing, where she ostensibly took her foot off the pedal or left it on the pedal to reach for the phone. And that was pretty darn implausible. And lots of laughs. Her block did a cartoon about it, which I think we also have because of the contortions that she had to go through. The great Her Block, also from Chicago, graduate of Sen High, by the way. You got her in court essentially to admit that she was lying, or at least to show that she was lying.
Well, I'd say I got to show that she was lying. Right. She never
She was loyal to the end.
She was loyal to the end. Although let's point out that Richard Nixon was not loyal because he's the one who pointed a finger at her. What happened was when they finally caved after the Saturday Night Massacre, public reaction, and I just want to stop on those words for a second, because people have forgotten how powerful public reaction is. Back then, both in terms of the Vietnam War and in terms of Watergate, the public outcry changed how government operated. And the outcry after Richard, and for those who don't know what the Saturday Night Massacre is, it was when Richard Nixon said, I am not giving them those tapes, and I'm firing Archie Cox for even asking. And he told his attorney general to fire him. And Attorney General Richardson said, no, I will not do it because there's no cause. And I promised Congress that I wouldn't fire him except for cause. So he was out. Then the Deputy Attorney General was given the same order, and he said, I made the same promise, I cannot do this. And so he was out, and Bork, who was the Solicitor General, was made acting Attorney General, and he carried out the order. 3 days later, the public reaction was so severe that Nixon realized he could not survive unless he moderated. So he said, okay, I'll give you the tapes, and I will appoint a new special prosecutor. We waited for the tapes, and then around Halloween, which, so remember, this was the 23rd was his reversal from the October 20th massacre. And he said, there's a little problem, 2 tapes are missing. Judge Sirica, being suspicious, said, instead of taking this to the grand jury, I want a public hearing where the White House proves that they didn't destroy these tapes. And we had a hearing. It was pretty inconclusive, but there was no reason to believe that it wasn't the accident that they said it was. But then on the Wednesday before Thursday, Thanksgiving, the White House announced in court, had us come to court, and they said, there's one more tape you can't have because it has an 18.5-minute gap where there should be the conversation. And that was the time that they went, we can find no innocent explanation for the gap, and only Rosemary Woods can tell us about it. In retrospect, I believe they knew all along that she did not do what I think she actually thought she might have done it, even though her explanation was laughable and led to not just the cartoon that you showed, Her Block even did more than one, and other cartoonists did, and every newspaper and magazine, there were at that point weekly news magazines, all had her picture on the cover. It wasn't possible. I believe that for sure it was probably Richard Nixon, who probably in deciding he wouldn't let us have the tapes said, let me listen to them first. And he listened to this particular tape that she erased. It was the first one on our subpoena of 9. He listened to it and went, oh, this is terrible. I've got to get rid of it. He erased it. Then he listened to the second one and went, ooh, this is really bad too. I can't erase them all, so I'm going to stonewall. I'm just not going to turn them over. That's what I think happened. But she actually thinks she erased it, runs into his office and says, Mr. President, I had this terrible accident. He then goes, and the first thing he does is he calls Alexander Haig, and they go for a ride in the presidential limousine, just randomly driving around Washington so they can be away from any possible overhear. The recording devices had been removed by that time, so he wasn't afraid he'd be recorded. And that's the only explanation I can have, is that maybe it was the two of them had done it and they were letting her take the blame. So that's how we got to the state. I asked her in court to demonstrate, and her demonstration failed. And for everyone listening, if you can picture a jury box, you know, it's this big. The tape machine was placed in front of her. I said, show us how you were, you know, approaching this. She put on her headphones so that she could listen to it. And I asked her the next question, and she took her headphone and went, "What?" I said, "Well, if you can't hear me, you'll have to take those off and we'll pretend they're on." And then she said, "Okay, the phone rang," and I reached behind me, but she didn't actually get to that point. She went, "Well, first I had to take those off." And she pointed to the headset. I don't think you can see it in this picture. No, you can't, but she just literally pointed in the jury box and her foot came off the pedal. And the tape, of course, stopped erasing, because if you notice in this picture, her left foot is extended. It's underneath there it was a pedal to keep the tapes rotating. Now, she says she answered the phone and kept her foot on the pedal. Now, anybody who's ever sat at a desk at a wheeled chair knows that you would have wheeled the chair to your phone. Your foot would have been off the pedal. There would have been no erasure. So, I mean, it was clearly, but she insisted she had done it that way in the White House. And so I said to the judge, "Well, Your Honor, maybe we should adjourn this hearing to the White House." And for reasons I will never understand, her lawyer didn't object. The White House lawyers didn't object. And Judge Sirica said, "Sure, fine." So this was my first time in the White House, and not just in the White House on a public tour, but I was adjacent to the Oval Office, which was, her office overlooks the Rose Garden. It's all, you know, it's a beautiful, beautiful, lovely setting. That's a real oil painting from the Smithsonian hanging on her wall. But she was, I mean, physically, she did do that. Now, I didn't stay there to say, "Can you hold that position for 18 and a half minutes?" Because it's quite obvious that she could not have. One other thing I noticed that I never noticed before until I was writing this book is, I don't know if anyone can see my cursor, but if you look at the orange triangle in her dress, and then there's a blue part, a turquoise part, there's a little black dot. She was wearing a pin. And I find that so amazing, because I've become known for Jill's pins, was that I was wearing a pin that day as well. I think there's a picture of me coming out of the White House, which if you have, I don't know if you have that one. Yeah, look on my ascot, I'm wearing a pin. And so I've always worn pins, and I love that she was too, in retrospect. I also wanted to portray her in the book as her friends and family knew her, but they all thought I was the evil prosecutor who embarrassed her, whereas I was just doing my job and trying to seek the truth. And subsequent to finishing the book, her grandnephew called me and said, "Sorry about that, my dog has decided to join the party." That's the joy of working at home. He said that he would talk to me, and I've now spent several hours with him, and would love to write maybe I'll write just a magazine article about it, because I think I could portray her more fully than the cartoon character that you've seen before.
Well, maybe he can also offer an explanation for that rather intriguing development in 1997, when tapes came out suggesting that mild-mannered Rosemary Woods had stashed almost $100,000 in cash in a safe in her apartment for, let's say, for example, the President of the United States. But we should move on so I really want to talk about the media in this case. We obviously have a president now who has a thing or two to say about the media. And I'm wondering, first of all, were there things as an investigator that you learned from reporting that you wouldn't have otherwise known? Were reporters generally helpful to your cause, not intentionally, but through their work, or did they actually get in the way?
None of the above for the most part, I would say. Woodward and Bernstein were clearly important in keeping the story alive, because it might have just faded away into nothingness.
But not so much in breaking news. It was meaningful to the
No, I
investigation.
mean, because we had to get not hearsay evidence, we had to interview all the right people. So I don't think there's anything we learned. I learned in writing the book that there was one time where a grand juror actually told Bernstein something that we didn't know. And I mean, she basically said the grand jury really wanted to indict Richard Nixon. And we knew that. I mean, there's no question we knew that. And we had Leon Jaworski come in to tell them why he was not going to allow that. And they had a secret meeting where they voted to indict. And they were so enthusiastic that most of them raised 2 hands, according to this story. And she had told that to Bernstein. He did call for confirmation and was persuaded that it would be very detrimental to publish that, and he did not. So,
because it's so interesting when you think about what a lot of us know, of course, is the Hollywood version of what brought down Richard Nixon.
Yes.
If you think of All the President's Men, which was nominated for Best Picture in 1977, and I think Jason Robards won an Academy Award for portraying Ben Bradley, and it was the heroic reporters from the Post who kind of made it all happen. But you did also mention a few minutes ago the importance of public opinion, and I imagine that the media must have been part of that that side of the story, as you say, keeping things going. Tell us about how that played out.
Well, as I say, after the Saturday Night Massacre was the best example, where we were inundated with canvas bags. I don't know if anybody remembers mail that came in, bags that were 4 feet high. We were inundated. The White House was inundated. And of course, the press was also universally. There was no Fox News giving a different version. Everybody was saying how bad this was. And it persuaded the president, literally. He fired on a Saturday, October 20th, and on October 23rd, he announced that he would turn over the tapes. So it had a dramatic impact. And another thing to mention is that our press officer, James Doyle, felt that in order for people to trust us, and they needed to know us, not us in terms of our work, but just who we were. And so he arranged for interviews, which is very unusual. So, going forward to the Mueller investigation, how many people, except for Andrew Weissman, who's on television now, would have recognized anyone from the Mueller investigation? You wouldn't. But we were interviewed so that people would know that we were not out to get the president, that we were just investigating facts.
Now, is that a good thing? Would you recommend that now?
Yes, I mean, I think it is. It's certainly fair. The public knows the defendant, so why shouldn't they know the people who are doing the investigation? In Mueller, of course, you had press reporting, some parts of the press reporting that these were all evil Democrats who were biased and out to get the president, and there was no rebuttal to that. So I think that's a bad thing. I think that it's fair to have fairness and to have the facts out there.
When you think about how much of this does, and this is true of the Trump administration, how much of it plays out in public, and how much everything really is up for grabs. And of course, Nixon at the time was quite famous for having an enemies list long before Donald Trump referred to the media as the enemies of the people. He had his enemies list. On it was Daniel Schorr.
Yes.
Of CBS. He was described on the list, the actual list, as a real media enemy. And the great Mary McGrory, whom you met, I know, the notation was daily hate Nixon articles. And then the LA Times managing editor, Ed Guthman, described as a hatchet man, that it's time to give him the message. So there was a sense of attack on the media, and yet it wasn't the same as what Donald Trump does.
Well, the only difference really is that Donald Trump says it out loud.
Right.
Richard Nixon had a secret list,
right,
and wanted to use the IRS, go after them that way. But it wasn't public. Donald Trump announces that they're evil, terrible people, and that people shouldn't pay any attention to anything the press says except for Fox News. And so it's a serious problem. I think if we had had Fox News back in the Watergate era, Richard Nixon might have survived. I can't imagine that in the kind of divisive silos that we're in right now, that anyone would have admitted anything and they would have gotten away with it. The only difference is that as bad as Nixon was in terms of, permitting crimes and saying, if I do it, it's not a crime and the ends justify the means, he did have a sense of the rule of law. He did understand the function of government, and he did have a sense of shame. And you can't embarrass some people, but you could shame Richard Nixon. And I think that influenced how he responded.
If Fox, you're fabulous at anticipating questions. We have a couple of questions from the audience, focusing on exactly that point. Had Fox existed 50 years ago, how do you think things would have been different, and why would they have been different?
Well, we had 3 networks at the time. We had NBC, ABC, CBS, and they all had really storied hosts. The anchors were universally recognized as terrific, honest people, and they all had the same facts. So wherever you were, whatever spectrum of the politics you were on, you saw the same facts. Republican and Democrat, independent, everybody heard the same facts. It's one thing to debate what policies or consequences of facts are, as opposed to debating the facts. Nowadays, with Fox News, we do not have an agreed statement of facts. I just saw an interview by someone named Klepper from The Daily Show of Trump supporters at Trump rallies. They clearly do not have the same information that I have. And it's scary and it's horrible, because they will make their voting decisions based on what I believe to be, what Kellyanne Conway called alternative facts, which to me is defined as a lie, because there is only one fact. You can have nuances maybe, but you don't have 2 opposite facts. So
I can vouch for that from my reporting. I've been recently in Wisconsin and down in North Carolina, talking with Trump supporters, and there's very little there is no intersection. They're not different planes when it comes to the facts. And wasn't it, shall we say, ironic when the vice president in his debate with Kamala Harris used Daniel Patrick Moynihan's line that, madam, you were entitled to your opinions, but not to your own set of facts. And here was Mike Pence. But we're running out of time, sadly. And I want to, before we go, I want to make sure we get to Donald Trump. And in particular, you write rather searingly at the end of your book about Trump versus Nixon. And you write this, you say, as I write this more than 4 decades after Watergate, I see history repeating itself with the presidency of Donald Trump. Like Nixon, Trump is corrupt, amoral, vindictive, paranoid, ruthless, and narcissistic. But tell us what you really think. But you also say that his stonewalling surpasses Nixon's. So where are we now? Have we learned nothing, or has society learned something, but maybe we have a president and a team that haven't? Where how do you see it?
And I actually sent a cartoon to you that I think captures in some part that Trump hasn't learned. I don't know if you can see what it says underneath, but can you maybe show? It says something like, it's time for us to have a chat. You have to learn something from me. And it's the ghost of Nixon talking to Trump. And I think we haven't learned so much because, for example, when I said the stonewalling is worse, what I'm referring to is the fact that it's not just stonewalling in terms of a criminal investigation, the impeachment, or his taxes, which have been requested, but he has refused to let people testify even about the normal routine oversight function of Congress. So when there were questions about children in cages, he wouldn't let anyone testify. That is obstructing what I consider the foundation of our Constitution and the separation of powers and the three branches of government that we're supposed to have with oversight of the executive by Congress. So to me, that's much more serious in terms of stonewalling. It's not just protecting himself from criminal investigation, but it's interfering with government. And part of the reason I wrote the book is because it does reflect a time when bipartisanship was in existence, when democracy worked, and when justice prevailed. And I think we can have that again. And all of us need to take very seriously the choices we make in who we support, because we want to get that back. And I think that's something that does show in the book. I don't want to go back to the era of the sexism of the ages, but there are parts of it that I would like to see back again.
Sure. Well, we have time for a couple of very quick questions. And one of them is, what would it take to persuade you that Donald Trump should be indicted?
Well, if he is voted out of office, you would have to weigh, as I was saying earlier, the benefits of indicting him in terms of justice versus do we need to put this behind us and focus on policy accomplishments for a new administration? If he is reelected, I would say New York needs to go forward because, and we need to see what the evidence shows, but based on New York Times reporting of his tax returns, I would say that there is quite likely criminal behavior involved just in that.
A distinction between an indictment that essentially would be, you would hope would drive him from office in a second term, and an indictment afterward that could be more debatable?
Well, no, what I'm saying is if he is not reelected and you have you have Biden as president, since that's your choice is either one of those two, Biden needs to make a decision as to whether he would be his administration would be distracted. I think Biden is someone who wants to bring the country together again. And you're not going to heal the divisions by pursuing a criminal case at the federal level against the former president. But I don't feel the same way about a state doing it. That doesn't affect what would then be the new president in the same way that if his Department of Justice pursued it, and Department of Justice could include, obviously the U.S. attorneys as well. Now, does that mean that those crimes would go unpunished? I don't know how bad they all are, and if I were the Attorney General making a review, I might feel very differently about it. The emoluments have gone completely unpunished, and a court recently said that members of Congress can't bring that suit. So I don't know who can enforce the rights of the people to a constitutional provision that says he can't benefit from being in office. So it's a very complicated question that as a youngster during Watergate, I had clear answers, indict, indict, indict. Now I'm more mature, and I think that accomplishing a coalescing of Republicans and Democrats, and I'm afraid because of seeing things like you're witnessing in your reporting, there are a certain group of people who will never believe that he lost legally because he keeps saying it. He's using propaganda techniques of say it loud, say it often, and people will believe you. And he has the support of Fox News and Breitbart and other people who are amplifying his message on Twitter and elsewhere.
So that brings us full circle to where we were, what we started talking about, which was that moment when Nixon left and Gerald Ford talked about the nightmare being over, and then pardoning him. And in that speech on August 9th, 1974, Ford echoed Lincoln, who had said in the Gettysburg Address that it was time to bind up the nation's wounds. Ford said, "As we bind up the internal wounds of Watergate, more painful and more poisonous than those of foreign wars, Let us restore the golden rule to our political process. Let brotherly love purge our hearts of suspicion and of hate. Based on your experience of Watergate and what you've seen next and what you know of Trump's dealings, is that just hopelessly naive?
No, it's not. And I think it is an important goal. I don't want to see a civil war between a minority which is currently ruling us, because keep in mind that Donald Trump lost the popular vote and still he's ruling us. So I don't want to see a permanent division between, people who supported him and people who didn't. Democrat, Republican, Independent. I would like to see us come together and to be able to actually compromise again. There was a play at Northlight called City of Conversation. And it was, the first act was during the Kennedy administration, and it was a socialite hosting a dinner for Democrats and Republicans who had genial conversation and reached compromise. Then the second act was the Carter administration that I proudly served in. And there was a little dialogue, but it wasn't quite the same. And it ended with the Obama administration, in which, of course, conversation is gone. We need to get back to having dialogue. It's not a win-lose. I did a lot of negotiating for Motorola, and it's got to be a win-win. Everybody has to give a little in order for everybody to win. And there are certain common goals that we all share. And I think we need to get back to those. We need to protect voting. I hope everyone here has got a plan to vote, and we'll do it whether it's using a drop box or the mailbox or voting in person. If you can, vote early so that you don't have the crowds. But this is our responsibility as American citizens, and it's time for us to all speak up. Let us know who you support, what you believe in. And so I don't think it's naive. I think it is my hope that we can return to a democracy where the Attorney General is not the lawyer for the president. And by the way, Attorney General Mitchell ended up in jail. I wonder what will happen with Attorney General Barr.
That is a question that someone has asked, in fact, but we were running out of time, and you will know this prompt from your appearances on MSNBC and elsewhere in about 30 seconds. Please tell us, because viewers are asking, tell us about your pin, the pin you're wearing.
The pin I'm wearing, and I'll try posting a picture on my website, which is jillwinebanks.com. But let me see if I can. It's actually, it sort of moves, as you can see. It's a couple with the woman dancing backwards. And that's because at one point I wanted to call my book Dancing Backwards in High Heels, which is a phrase that was used about Ginger Rogers, who had to do everything Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in high heels. And I think it does reflect the era of my coming of age, when women had to do everything better than men to be considered half as good. And I think we've come a long way, but we aren't there yet. I think that Hillary Clinton was definitely impacted by not being a man. If she had been a man, it would have been a very different outcome. And so I am still looking forward to full equality. I might even quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was asked, when will there be enough justices on the Supreme Court who are female? And she said, well, of course, when there are 9. And the reporter was like, what, 9? She said, well, there's always been 9 men, and no one's ever asked whether that's too many. So why not 9 women? And I would be happy with 5 or 6 maybe. But I'm looking forward to full equality, maybe even passage of the ERA to guarantee our rights.
Well, from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, thanks for covering the landscape with us, Jill. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for these great questions, everyone, and for the opportunity to be with you.
Sure.
And Jill and Peter, let me also say thank you on behalf of the Newberry. Jill, speaking so passionately about the importance of conversation and the importance of dialogue, that's a value that we hold at the library and that we try to live and practice every day. So it's wonderful to be able to welcome you, Jill, and you, Peter, to model that for us so well. And thanks to all of you for joining us today for this installment of Conversations at the Newberry. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in just a few days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please support the Newberry by making a gift today. You can do that online at newberry.org/give. Thank you very much. We also look forward to welcoming you to our next virtual program on Tuesday, October 27th. That program is aligned with one of our current exhibitions on view at the library, Decision 1920, A Return to Normalcy, which looks at the presidential election of 100 years ago. Our speakers on October 27th will discuss the way that 4 constitutional amendments passed between 1913 and 1920 radically transformed American politics, culture, and everyday life, setting the stage for the 1920 presidential election. You can register for this and other public programs on our website, newberry.org. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.